Hi everyone, this is Tim Guy. I'm here to talk about interviews and how you can use them to collect data. So, interviews, what are they? An interview is basically a way of collecting data through asking questions. You kind of pull aside either individuals or groups and kind of ask them questions about whatever you're researching. The text actually suggested that you prepare a interview guide when you go to do this and have either pre-prepared questions or sort of like a list of what you're trying to get at from whoever your correspondents are whenever you're doing the interview. A lot of times when you're talking about interviews, they're paired with observational data. So basically, you would observe what your students or whoever you're doing your research on, and then you would go ahead and interview them afterwards and kind of get some more information that way. Usually, it's associated with qualitative data. In fact, both texts that we had to read talked about them being qualitative data, and that's when you just ask people and you kind of get open-ended responses, or even when they give you multiple choice respondents back. But there is some versions out there where it would be quantitative, but a lot of times that can kind of veer into the survey side more so than an interview. But if it's done in person, it's kind of a weird gray area. So it's usually qualitative, but sometimes can be quantitative. And basically, to make it quantitative, you would assign values to what people are saying to kind of give them a score. And again, that kind of leads into more of a survey area. It can be done individually or in groups, depending on how you want to collect your data. You can either do like a group interview and ask questions to a bunch of groups, or you can make sure you pull each person individually. There's multiple types, and both texts kind of had a different breakdown of the types, but I like the book that we had to read. They kind of had two different versions. They had called one the informal ethnographic interviews, aka informal interviews, and then a structured formal interview. The informal interviews are more like a casual conversation. Basically, you would get your participants together and just sort of kind of ask them some questions to try to lead into whatever sort of research you're doing. It did suggest that whenever you're doing a informal interview, to make sure you know what the point of your research is and not try to ask questions that, even though you feel like you need to ask them, are not actually part of your research. You want to make sure you kind of focus in on what your topic is. With informal interviews, you are allowed to ask different questions to different participants. It does not need to be the same kind of questions to everybody. The book that we read had a suggestion from a study from Agar, where he said you should have the 5 W's and the H questions ready. Basically, who, what, where, why, and how. You need to make sure you have all those questions ready to go, because that'll help lead sort of the conversation with whoever your participants are and get them to kind of open up and be able to have that casual conversation you're looking for. A lot of times when informal interviews are done, the responses that you get, you kind of either just do sort of a informal summary afterwards, or after you meet with the person or the group, you kind of just jot down some notes about what happened, or you can have an anecdotal report that you fill out while they are doing their interview, and you just kind of write down again just sort of a gist of what's going on and maybe some reasons why. If you look on page 120 in the book, they have an example of what that anecdotal report could look like. A structured interview is a little bit different. The main difference is that in this case, you need to ask the exact same questions to each participant. So basically, you need to have all your questions pre-prepared. So it's not going to be sort of a you go wherever they lead you kind of thing. It's I'm asking these 10 questions, and they're going to answer these 10 questions. Your questions should have a mix of divergent and convergent questions. Basically, that means open-ended and closed questions. So basically, you shouldn't ask like, hey, what's your name? And then, how are you doing? Those would be two different examples, right? How are you doing is more open-ended. You can respond more. What's your name is more closed. Obviously, you wouldn't ask those in a research setting, but that's just an example of convergent and divergent. A lot of times when you're doing a structured interview, you're going to use a digital recorder to keep track of everything that the person says. In fact, in this case, a lot of times they said that you're going to transcribe exactly what they said to each question, because again, you're interviewing them. Not going to make them write it down. You're just kind of talking. And they said that this one can take a lot of time. In fact, the one source that we read said that their motto was every hour of a structured interview would be 9 hours of transcribing afterwards. So that's kind of the big time thing that happens when you do a structured interview. Normally, you want to do them in a private area and kind of conduct them so that the people or the group kind of are just with you, and it's much more formal. So again, we talked about this a little bit already, but what kind of data are you collecting here? It's almost always considered qualitative. Again, I said earlier that you can make it quantitative by kind of assigning a number score to what their responses are. But again, that starts to leave a little bit into the survey territory. So it kind of depends on how you want to define a interview versus a survey. Like if it's in person, I'm asking them, then it's got to be an interview, but I'm giving them a score. So it kind of can get a little weird there. And then one of the big reasons that we want to do an interview and why it can be helpful is that it can get into the hows and whys. So when you're kind of asking people questions and kind of talking to them, you can really get kind of the background on what they're thinking and why maybe they did something. So if you're doing a survey on, let's say, like the flipped classroom, like I'm going to be looking at, and you see that the students are not succeeding, an interview can be really helpful because you can kind of get from students, oh, they actually hate what we're doing, and that's why they're not doing their homework or whatever it is, and they're not succeeding. Or maybe you find that they really like it, but they're struggling with something else, and you can get some of that clarification of why certain things are going on in your classroom and how certain things are kind of being conducted. So it can be really helpful to kind of explain sort of what's going on with whatever you're researching. So some of the strengths, again, what I just talked about in terms of what kind of questions are really good for, that's definitely a strength. Some other things too is that you can record the feedback. So when they're talking to you during their interview, you can record it, get exactly what they're saying, have exactly written, evidence there for you to use. So that can be really helpful so you don't like mix words up with people. It often can encourage people to share more because it's a little more informal, especially the informal interview, obviously. You can kind of just have a casual conversation and people will be more willing to share exactly what they're feeling and what they're thinking. Sometimes it can provide a lot of clarification for you on what you're observing. So again, it pairs a lot with observation, but if you're observing, hey, little Johnny is not doing a great job at the flipped classroom, and then you go and you have an interview with him and you find out that, oh, little Johnny doesn't have internet access and he can't do it at home, or you find out that his mom is telling him she hates the flipped classroom, he shouldn't do it, and it's changing his attitude. You can get those sort of clarifications and things that you're seeing that you might not get just from doing observation alone. And then I actually looked up a little bit online about what other people had to say about interviews, and one of the things I saw from a couple different sources was they called it adding a human dimension to your data. And basically they said if you just have all quantitative data and just hard numbers, a lot of times somebody who's reading it, especially if they're not part of the scientific community, might not get as much out of it. Whereas if you have an interview and you kind of get like the personal feelings towards you might be able to get some more people to buy on with what you're doing. Some of the weaknesses, and again, I talked a little bit about these already, but it's time consuming, especially the formal interview. Transcribing all that down can take a really long amount of time. Respondents, it said, cannot keep their anonymity. Obviously, you're asking them questions and you get to see them and you can put a name to the interview, and that kind of takes away some of the anonymity that they normally would have when being in a study. And then this one I said it was a strength, but also kind of be a weakness because when you're having an informal interview, you can encourage people to open up more. But when you're also can make people not willing to open up more, depending on the power dynamic you have with your respondent. So especially in our case as teachers and students, a student might not be willing to share with you that they don't like an activity you're doing because they feel like, oh, you as a teacher have power over me because you can give me a grade. I'm not going to be honest and helpful and truthful with what I'm saying. And that can really affect what data you're collecting because all my students said everything was great and they loved it, but everybody failed, so I don't know why that was happening. You might not get truthful responses from your students. Some concerns that I might have about doing an interview in terms of some of the different things we've talked about so far in this course. So in terms of validity, kind of going back to what I just said about will students tell you the truth? If I try to ask my students, do you like this? And they're afraid to tell me that, that's going to change how valid my study actually is, it's because they're not truthful about what they're saying. In terms of reliability, the interviewee or the interviewer can really affect how the interview goes, and that might make it different from group to group. I think this is one of the least reliable sources, just because if I'm interviewing and I ask certain kinds of questions and then you try to replicate my study and you ask different kinds of questions in your interview, that can really change what kind of responses you might get. You might get to the heart of something that I never reach. And so that can be a big concern in terms of conducting an interview. And last but not least, in terms of the ethical nature, again, that lack of anonymity, taking that away from your respondents, that can really be something that can help them, especially depending on what you're researching, and that can really change things. So thank you for watching my kind of brief overview on interviews, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something.